The land price over the last 20 years has gone up about 10 times. It's about 10 times more expensive than it was 20 years ago. If Gord Perks doesn't think $100,000 is a lot of money, I want to be his friend because he is clearly wealthier than I am. And I get this all the time from municipal politicians where they say, oh, it's really not that much money. Really? $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 is not a lot of money.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
And today we're talking about the price of new homes. 20 years ago, you could buy a brand new single detached house for less than $200,000 in much of Ontario. New home prices have more than tripled since then, while the price of everything else has gone up probably closer to about 50%.
But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. So, Cara, you've owned a home for a few years now. So when you decided to go from being a renter to an owner, what were home prices like back then?
Very expensive. I mean, I feel like I got in at the time after, 2022, everything went up and then things started dropping and then they started going back up again. And I got in while they were down. But I mean, I was looking at something around in Toronto, this tiny place for in the $900,000 range. And that took a long time to find. It was very expensive.
That is a lot of money. I'm almost afraid now to tell you what it was like for me. So if we go back to 2004, so about 20 years ago, my then girlfriend, now wife, we decided to become homeowners. And we looked around and we found a place to our liking in London, Ontario, in a brand new subdivision that was just being built. So we went out and we purchased a brand new single detached 2-story 3-bedroom house for, wait for it, $168,000.
That's almost exactly half of what I had to pay for my down payment in order to get the payments to work with family help, obviously, like everyone else in my generation.
Well, yeah, and I think our down payment was just over $30,000. Like we put down 20%, and I thought that was just a massive amount of money. I'm like, wow, this down payment is more than what it costs to buy a new car. This is just bananas. And now it sounds so quaint that you could buy a home for $168,000 with a $35,000 down payment that covered 20% of the mortgage.
I know that's in what some might call fake London and not Toronto, but it's still like when I hear those prices, I'm like, oh, because I know that even if I went to London now, it's like you can't get anything for 3 times that, at least 4 times that's 5. I don't know these days, but I know that it's nothing near that. Nowadays, if you were to actually buy that home, like how much more is it?
Yeah, well, because the neighborhood was one of those neighborhoods where there were basically like 4 different home models across the entire neighborhood, it's very easy to see what they would sell for these days. And I do, like a lot of Gen Xers and frankly, a lot of boomers, one of my kind of annoying hobbies is to go to realtor.ca or go to some of the sold websites and see what things are going for.
So weird.
And I know it's weird. Something happens when you turn 45. You start looking at these websites. It's going to happen to you. Don't judge. It happens to all of us once we get our gray hair. Anyhow, so if I go to these sites or look at the sold listings, it sells for about $650,000. And that's actually about the price if you wanted to build a brand new home that was similar today, kind of on the outskirts of London, Ontario. That's, you're paying in that kind of $600,000 to $700,000 range. Now, if that home had just gone up at the rate of inflation, it should just be worth about $250,000. That's, $170,000 20 years ago. It's worth about $250,000 today. Instead, this home is worth $650,000. So it's gone up an extra $400,000 beyond what would be justified by inflation.
Are you trying to make me cry?
No, I mean that's just a side benefit of this. And to be fair, I don't own that home anymore. So I think I sold it. I was trying to think. We sold it in like 2009 for about $250,000, and we were very very happy at the time that we made a little bit of money from this.
How does it make sense that it's like 3 or 4 times more expensive now for a young family to buy a home than it was for you 20 years ago?
So there's a lot to look at this, but I think the best way to do it is be a little bit methodical here. Let's go kind of break this down step by step in all of the things that it takes to build a home. We're going to make this as interesting and engaging as possible. And to start, I'd like to break it down into three buckets. That the first bucket is all of the things that you need before you actually start construction of the home. Things like land and permits and architectural designs and things like that. The second is the actual construction of the home, the electricians and drywall and lumber, all of that great stuff. And then the third is the taxes that you pay once you build that home. And, a warning to our listeners, I want to keep this, relatively short episode because this is the kind of thing that we could talk about for days. So I'm going to miss a bunch of stuff in here. And what I would love from you, from listeners, particularly those who are watching on YouTube, leave a comment about what I missed, what I failed to talk about, because there's going to be a bunch of it. And we'd love to hear from you.
So let's go through each one at a time. Let's start with how much you're paying for things before you build, as you said.
So the first obvious thing you need is the land, right? You got to actually physically build this somewhere. And the land price, and kind of hold on to your hats, people. The land price over the last 20 years has gone up about 10 times. It's about 10 times more expensive than it was 20 years ago. So in this kind of part of London, Ontario, you could get an acre of development land for, about $100,000, maybe a little bit more, maybe a bit less, depending on where it is and so on. Nowadays, you're looking at over $1 million an acre. And in fact, there's a lot, or there's a plot of land just beside the house that we built in 2004 that's currently selling 2 acres for $4 million. So, $2 million an acre. I think that's a little expensive. I don't think they're going to get it. But that is a big part of what's going on, is that land prices have absolutely gone through the roof.
It's so weird to me to think about the outskirts of London being somewhere that's gone up that much because, like, I know it's lovely, but I also don't think of it as being the most desirable area to live in. So then I'm thinking, if outskirts of London went up that much, like, how much did it go up in places like that are actually closer to city centers like Toronto?
You were about to say places that people actually want to live, and that's okay. You can say that, and I would say in a lot of places, 10x as well. Now they started at a higher level and have gone to a higher level, and there's a lot of variability here. And we don't, and this is a point that Meredith will love. We don't have great data on this. A lot of it is very sort of
In fact,
proprietary.
I think she'll hate that,
Um,
not love it.
well, she'll hate it, but she'll love the fact that we're talking about it. So this raises the obvious question, like, what the heck happened? Like, why could land prices go up tenfold during that time? And it's just a combination of first of all, population growth, right? We have more people, more demand for housing, and so on, coupled with restrictions on land. About 20 years ago, and you and I actually talked about this with Jason Slaughter. Highly recommend that episode. 20 years ago, like, we got really concerned about sprawl. Like, the way that we were building the homes that I bought is that cities just kept expanding, and expanding out, adding more and more development land. But that causes issues to the environment, causes issues to municipal finance. So we decided, hey, maybe that's not such a great growth model. So we did things like the green belt. We did things like urban growth boundaries. But at the same time, we never really created the conditions to build up. So we're kind of building the same kinds of things, but we were just doing so on less and less land. So that's going to make that land more valuable. That's going to make that land skyrocket in value. And because you've created this scarce asset, that's when the investors start coming in, the speculators come in, and so on. and they're just adding fuel to a dumpster fire. And that is probably, again, it depends on the location, depends on the type of house, but that is actually probably the largest factor in home prices increase, is just the underlying cost of land.
I guess that answers people's questions of like, why is Canada running out of land when we're the second largest landmass? And I guess when you artificially constrain it that way, it's going to make prices go up.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So it's not a question of how much land is in the country, but where is it and what you're allowed to do on it, and that also affects the price of land. Is that sort of permissions, right? The more you can do on that land, the more that is legally possible. The more that land's going to be worth, and which takes us to the kind of second thing that you need after this is those permissions. All of the various permits and things like that. And there are more of those. Eric Lombardi posted a great list of all the sort of types of permits and studies and things like that you need to do. We can post that in the show notes.
And he's the head of More Neighbors Toronto, which is an advocacy group, a YIMBY advocacy group.
Absolutely, and a great follow. And Altus Group came out with a report recently, just looking at the GTA, but around the cost and time to get all of these approvals. And it was a benchmarking study, so they compared different communities in the GTA. And depending on what's getting built, that can take a couple years, and it costs money during that time. Part of that money comes from the fact that you need to have professionals filling out all these forms and things like that. But part of it is just that you have to finance the land and you have to finance all these things. So while that clock is ticking, you're paying all of interest on all of these things. So you're paying several $1,000s a month while you're waiting to get all these permitting. And that's not to suggest, like, I'm not coming on here like ultra libertarian going, let's just get government completely out of the way and like, who cares about endangered species and all of these things. But our systems over time have gotten more complex. There's, more rules and regulations, many of which are there for a good reason. That need to get streamlined. And we are seeing cities start to streamline these processes, but it's a lot tougher slog today than it was in 2004 when I was buying a home.
And when it comes to construction costs, how has that changed over the years?
Well, we still have an intermediate step here as well, which is the development charges piece. So a development charge is basically it's a bunch of money that you have to pay on a project, and that money gets earmarked to an infrastructure fund that municipalities have. Now, we should be clear that the developer themselves, they pay for the actual roads and sidewalks in the actual subdivision. But once you get out of the subdivision, the city's having to pay to, expand water pipes, put in, facilities, arenas, things like that. So that's what that money goes to. And that could be a whole sort of separate episode. When I bought my home in 2004, the development charge was $5,000 on a single detached home in London. Today, on a single detached home, it's $47,000. So it's gone up 10x. So right there, that's an extra $42,000 just for the development charge. And in parts of York region, you're getting close to $200,000, right? So if you think about it, like if I do the math on this, that just today, if you want to build a home in London, Ontario, the land cost for a lot and the development charges, just those two things cost more than I paid for my entire house 20 years ago. That doesn't include the house. That doesn't include all of the other things that go around it. But just the land and the development charges today cost more than all of it 20 years ago for a home like mine.
Recently, the chair of Toronto's Planning and Housing Committee, Gord Perks, was talking about how there's a lot of people who talk about development charges being a cost that has really led to the increase in the price of homes. And he was saying that and zoning, it's overrated because look at the changes that have been made to zoning and development charges. There have been freezes at some points. And it hasn't led to this big boom in construction. And in fact, prices are still going up. And people aren't dropping their prices on their condos enough that like you end up with a whole bunch of inventory that's not selling. So his argument was more they're building the wrong types of things. It's not the cost of it, it's that it's the wrong types of things, even if you lower the cost of building. How would you respond
Well,
to
we
that?
have to understand that what gets built is a function of cost, right? That with the price of land and the development charges, particularly in City of Toronto, uh, you're not going to be able to build something family friendly, right? That you're looking at costs at about $1,600 a square foot, right? So to put that in perspective, the home that I bought in London, Ontario, is about 1,200 square feet, which for a single detached is actually on the small side. Well, I'm going to make people do the math here, but 1,200 square feet times $1,600 a square foot, you're getting into about $2 million. So yeah, he's right in the sense that that stuff isn't getting built, but he's coming at it from the wrong place. And you know, if we look at the City of Toronto, those development charges were 20 years ago about the same level as London, about $5,000 for a single detached and, a little bit less for apartments. Now for, kind of family homes, they're over $100,000. If Gord Perks doesn't think $100,000 is a lot of money, I want to be his friend because he is clearly wealthier than I am. And I get this all the time from municipal politicians where they say, oh, it's really not that much money. Really? 100,000, 150,000, $200,000 is not a lot of money.
My experience though with municipal politicians is that they think that's free money coming out of the developers' profits and not coming out of the cost of the home. And I know that that's not something that you agree with. I know I keep asking like I don't get it. Why aren't like one bedroom condos dropping in price when we have so much inventory? Like clearly the demand isn't there at these prices. Why aren't they falling? And you keep telling me it's because they can't fall because it'll end up being a loss to the developers and they're not going to do that. But at the same time, I'm like, it seems weird to me that they aren't falling. It makes me wonder how much those development charges are contributing to the cost of the home, like to the end user. Do you know like how much of it is actually coming out of the profits versus from the end user?
Well, here's the scary thing. It's actually more than 100% goes to the end user. And you go, well, how is that possible? But we have to understand on development charges a few things. That first of all, the development charge gets paid when you get your building permit, right? That's when the developer has to pay it. But the developer gets paid for the final project at the end of the project. So for a single detached home, yeah, that might be about 9 months between when you pay these things and then when you get paid. For something like a condo, a high rise condo, that could be several years, right? And during that time, that developer is accruing a lot of interest on those development charges, right? Because they have to finance it. So, a dollar in development charges after interest, could be anywhere from a buck 05 to like a buck 30 or a buck 40, depending on what's getting built. But then on top of that, because development charges on the price of a home are treated the same way as like the cost of drywall or the cost of electrician, uh, GST, PST, and land transfer tax get assessed on not just the development charge, but the interest on the development charge. So you pay the buck in the development charge, then there's interest on top of that, which takes it to a buck 05 to a buck 30. Then you're paying 5% to the federal government in HST. You're paying 8% to the provincial government in PST. And then you're paying an additional, could be about 2% on land transfer tax. And then in the city of Toronto, you're paying an additional land transfer tax. And that dollar of development charge actually turns into about $1.50, again, depending on what's getting built. And politicians don't seem to understand that, right? That they seem to think, oh, well, we'll raise this $1 and yeah, the developer will pay most of it. And then some of it will go to the end user. But they don't understand the interest costs that go on development charges, and they don't understand the tax on tax that happens with development charges.
Why do so many of them still think that it's being paid by the developer?
I don't understand that. I think they're just thinking like they're gonna pocket it, like they're some kind of benevolent agency. It always cracks me up, right? That they're always greedy developers who are trying to screw everyone and just cheat everyone. But when a development charge increase goes up, they're gonna they're gonna be like, nah, I'm not gonna pass that along. I will just be benevolent and pocket that. So I don't understand it.
So you have land, you have permits, then these like charges and fees that developers have to pay. Are we finally getting to build it now?
We're finally getting to building now, and those costs have gone up faster than inflation, and that's one for the most part we can't blame politicians for. I've been sounding a little bit more kind of libertarian or right wing than a progressive like me is supposed to sound. So here's a case where we can actually look at the private sector.
I have to say, none of these
Again,
arguments seem to be very like progressive arguments in the sense that they tend to be what you're suggesting is less regulation, which tends to not be the progressive argument. It tends to be the more conservative argument. So I find it interesting that while you're arguing about cutting taxes, lowering the cost of charges for developers to build, making it easier to build, and you're like, but I'm very progressive about this, and I just
but
find it interesting.
I know. Trust me, I wake up with that contradiction every day, and I think this is one where the kind of small government folks have a point. But if we go to the construction side, again, data isn't great on this, but construction costs have gone up about twofold, maybe two and a half. So that's higher than the kind of 50%. We're actually looking at more of like 100 to maybe 125% increase. And that's for a couple of reasons. First, that wages have gone up in the construction sector faster than inflation. Or trades workers have done well over the last 20 years, and bless them for it. I'm very happy for them. And we haven't had much productivity increase in the home building sector. So we're using just as many electricians and drywallers and roofers as we did 20 years ago, and we're paying them more. We haven't had much in the way of productivity increases. And if anything, we're using more of those folks than we did because our homes have gotten more complicated, and often for good reasons. Like the building code has gotten more complicated to focus on things like energy efficiency or so on. So if anything, productivity's gone down in the home building sector. That's might be an oversimplification, but at least in large parts of it. So we're paying the workers more and we're needing more of them. And then a lot of the input costs are based on commodity prices, and those have generally risen higher than inflation. So you're looking at, lumber, things like that. They've basically doubled in price, in some cases tripled in price as well. So this is an area where I don't think you really can blame that on government, that input costs really have increased. But at the same time, they haven't gone up tenfold like they have on the land side or on the development charge side. But that is a real issue. And I think we need to see better policies to get more productivity in the home building sector, to streamline things, to, look at, building more modular and so on. So there's a lot of areas we can improve there. But absolutely, construction costs are a key issue.
So all these costs have gone up. Have the greedy developers we've been talking about, have their profits gone up 10 times too?
The answer to that is kind of yes and no. So on each individual unit, they are making more money than they were 20 years ago. But their profit margins really haven't gone up, or at least we haven't seen much evidence of that. Traditionally, the margins on construction tend to be the profit margin tends to be about 15% or higher. Anything lower than that, you actually can't get a construction loan. Like banks or the CMHC will just go, oh, your project is too risky. We're not going to loan you the money.
That's so weird, because you'd think if the costs have gone up of building a home, then they could make a decent amount of money still. The cash amount would be still very good, even if it's 13%, 12%, 10%, like something else like that.
Well, exactly, and that's how essentially they've made more money. Is not that the profit margin has gone up. It hasn't. If anything, it may have declined slightly, but they're doing it on a larger cost base. But the concerns that the banks, the CMHC, and others have is that that's kind of an expected margin, and there's a lot of risk here. I remember in the subdivision in 2004, they built kind of like L shape on the road, so we could see this from our backyard. They were building some homes in 2005. And Easter 2005, we had a big windstorm. These homes were half built, and it knocked 4 of them over. It was really interesting to see, like, just on my back porch drinking coffee, and I see all these homes slanted over. That was a big cost that developer had to pay for. So you get stuff like that, right? So it's more about expected margin, and they sort of realize that there's a lot of wiggle room there. And if something happens, commodity prices change or whatever, it doesn't take a lot for a profitable project to become unprofitable, and then the banks start worrying about getting their money back. But overall, yes, they're making more per unit, but no, their profit margins haven't gone up.
Any other costs we haven't talked about?
Well, we didn't get to the taxes. So at the end of it, and the taxes actually look a lot like the developer profits, that you have to pay the PST, the 8% PST, and that hasn't changed. But you're paying that on a much higher amount of money. So government's collecting more money even if that rate hasn't changed. You have to pay the GST. Now, that's actually gone down a little bit from 7% to 5%, but that's on a larger base. But we should also recognize that there's a GST rebate when you buy a new home, and that hasn't been indexed for inflation. And that tops out at $450,000 of the value of a home. So when I purchased my home in 2004, I got a rebate. If you're purchasing a home in London now, brand new home in London now in 2024, you're not getting a rebate unless something changes by the time we between our having this conversation when we air this episode. So that has been a big deal. So in essence, you probably are paying a higher rate in GST because you're not getting a rebate like I got. And then since 2004, we've seen the introduction of a variety of land transfer taxes. I'd say for the most part, the percentage that governments are getting on every build in GST, PST, and land transfer tax are about the same as they were in 2004, maybe a little bit higher. But the bigger difference is they're doing it on a much higher cost base. So provincial governments and federal government are getting extra billions each year from the fact that home prices have gone up. They're taxing homes as a percentage of the cost, so they're getting more money out of it.
It's kind of a weird thing then, because I think about how they kind of lack an incentive to lower housing prices in some ways. Obviously, politically, they want lower housing costs for people, but at the same time, I mean, sort of. They sort of want lower housing costs. They want lower housing costs for first-time buyers, and they want high housing costs for resale people. But they also have like their own monetary incentive to keep prices high, right?
They do. They do to a certain point. Absolutely. And particularly with land transfer tax, if you have high home prices and a market with a lot of sales, because the land transfer tax isn't just on new homes, it's on existing ones as well. You look at the provincial budget, there are years where they're bringing in, $5 billion a year in land transfer tax if it's a market with expensive homes and a lot of transactions. In a slower market, that might only be about 2 to 3 billion. So that pays for a lot of cancellation of license plate stickers and that kind of thing if you're bringing in an extra 2 to 3 billion on land transfer tax. So absolutely, we have to understand that yes, developers profit from high home prices and a lot of demand, but governments do as well, and they bring in extra billions each year from the fact that home prices are more expensive and their taxes are on a percentage basis. So if home prices double, their revenue roughly doubles.
So to sum it up, there's the cost of the land, there's the cost of the permits and the time involved, so the interest rates, there's the development charges and other fees, there's the construction costs, there's the taxes, there's the developer profits. And that's basically why we're never going to get another house built for $168,000 or even probably that adjusted for inflation, right?
Well, it shows how complex this problem is. If this episode had been 5 minutes long and I said, okay, it's just this one thing, and if we correct that, then everything's fine, it shows how multidimensional this is. So if we're going to restore affordability, we need to figure out how to make land less expensive. We need to figure out how to fund infrastructure and not put it all on development charges. We got to figure out how to streamline the permitting process. We've got to figure out how to lower construction costs. We've got to figure out how to get the CMHC to maybe be willing to loan at a 12% profit margin rather than a 15% one. So there's so many interrelated problems that we have to tackle. It makes the housing crisis so difficult, but it also means job security for you and I, because we're going to have no shortage of things to talk about here.
Sounds like you're not very hopeful that we're actually going to fix it permanently.
I think we are seeing some positive things happen. So I would say the removal of GST and PST on purpose-built rental has been a fantastic change. And this year, CMHC put out data showing that the first 6 months of this year, Canada has started more purpose-built rental projects than any time in recent history. So we're seeing that. We're seeing, positive zoning reforms. I think we're starting to have a grown-up conversation around land use. We're having conversations about, factory building of homes that we weren't having 5 years ago. So, despite the kind of gloom and doom I've had for most of this episode, I am actually cautiously optimistic that we're making moves in all of these directions. Obviously, we're not going far enough or fast enough, but the journey of 1,000 miles, begins with a single step. I think we've taken a few of those steps. So let's just keep moving in the right direction.
Can't start with a solution until you recognize the problem. That's the first step, they always say. So hopefully hearing all of these issues and where the stumbling blocks are is helpful for people to actually start to solve the problem. Thanks everyone for watching and listening, and thanks as always to our producer Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions or want to indicate any of the kind of major costs that I've missed, please send us a note at missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you.
And we'll see you next time.